Things can go wrong when we try to sign up with an email that already exists, for example. And Firebase actually gives us back a message that kind of gives us an idea what might have failed. By the way, in the official docs, you also get some example errors you could get back. For example, email exists, or for signing in, you could also get back email not found, invalid password, things like that. So you might want to handle these errors, or at least have some generic error handling process in place. And I will handle these errors by throwing my own error if something goes wrong. For that here, in the auth dart file in the providers folder, in Authenticate, where we send that request, where we do get an error in the end if something fails, I want to wrap that here with try catch. And you learned about that before, right? So here I'll just take this, get rid of the print statement here actually, wrap this into try and catch any error I might be getting here. And in here simply rethrow that error. Now we would get an error here if Firebase returns us a response with an error status code, or if we have no network connection or anything like that. The problem with Firebase here is that this response actually is not an error response. It doesn't have an error status code. And therefore, you learned that for post and get, the HTTP package would normally throw an error if your response has an error status code. Therefore, this does not happen here, because our response has a 200 status code, but simply contains a body that indicates that we have an error. Now that's not too common. You might be working with an API that actually gives you an error status code if something goes wrong, and therefore here, you might end up in the catch block and implement your logic here. Now, for me here, I have to check the response inside of try here and see if it, even though it's 200, it's a 200 code, if it contains an indicator that we have an error. And we see, thankfully, how an error response would look like regarding the response body. That's what we get here. So here I want to add a if check and check if my response, and they're actually the extracted body, so I'll store this in a separate constant to make my code a bit more readable. So my response data is JSON decode response body. We could have done all of that in one line. I just used 2 lines here to make it easier to read. So I want to check if my response data has an error key, because here we see we have an error key if we, well, have an error. So if this is not equal to null, or put in other words, if it exists, then we know, even though we have a 200 status code, we have a problem. So in here, I want to throw my own exception, and thankfully I built this HTTP exception class here in the last course module. So let's import that from the models folder there from the HTTP exception Dart. And that's a simple exception class which we can throw here, HTTP exception, and pass in a message. The message I want to pass in can also be extracted from Firebase response. In the error key, we have another nested map, and in that map here, we have a message key which contains that identifier that Firebase gives us, which is useful. So there, as a message to my exception here, I'll forward response data, then access the error key, and then in that inner map, the message key, to basically forward that identifier that Firebase gives me as part of the exception I throw. Now, what's the idea behind throwing an exception here? Well, we can, of course, now manage or handle that exception in the off screen, which is where we're in the widget and where we can present something to the user, show an alert to the user, for example. So here on the off screen, we can now wrap our entire if-else block here in a try-catch block, because either of these two actions could fail. Both signing up and logging in can fail, so we want to wrap that in a try block. And now I'll use a different version of that catch method. Instead of catching any error, I'll check if I got a specific kind of error. And we do that with the on keyword here. So on, and then you specify the class, the type of exception you want to handle. I want to handle my own HTTP exception, so therefore we first of all have to import that from the models folder and the HTTP exception Dart file. And with that import added up there, down here we can check on HTTP exception, then catch the error. So we still have catch error here, but we filter the errors we want to catch basically. And then you can still also have a generic catch error after that to catch any errors which are not of type HTTP exception. So for example, errors that occur because you lost a network connection or anything like that. But the custom HTTP exception, which in my case, in this scenario here, is only thrown if we failed validation of the data basically, that will be handled here in this special catch block. Now, why do I do it like that? Why do I have two catch blocks? Because I want to show it to you. I want to show you this filtering mechanism, and because I want to show a different message based on which error occurred. My error message down there should simply be could not authenticate you. Please try again later. Because maybe we had no internet connection, maybe Firebase was down, we don't know. So that's the message we'll use there, and I'll work on displaying it in a second. The message up here is different. There I also have my default error message, where we could also say authentication failed. And yes, you could of course therefore merge both blocks together kind of, but again, I also want to show this filtering. So here, that's my default message, but now I want to check what's inside the error. And please remember that we pass a message into our exception here. We do that in the auth.dart file in providers. We pass that identifier Firebase gives us. So that's inside of the exception, and that's what we catch here in the end. So now we can add a switch statement here and switch on our error message here, or simply on error to string, which also, thanks to our method here, returns the message. So we want to switch the value that's stored in there. And then here we can define different cases where we want to alter that message. Now the thing is, Firebase does not always provide a clean identifier like this. Sometimes it's also a short sentence where this identifier is included, and a switch statement will look for exact matches. So I will actually work with a couple of if statements instead. If you had an API that gives you clear identifiers and always the same structure of identifier, then you could absolutely use a switch statement. Here, I'll use a if statement instead and check my error to string, so what is stored in the error, and call contains on that. Every string has the contains method where you can check whether in that string you have a certain word or a certain term is included. And here, for example, we can check for email exists. And if that is true, then we know that we have that identifier at least included in a sentence if it's more than one word. And then I know that my error message here should actually be overwritten, and that's why I use var instead of final. And it should now be this email address exists or is already in use maybe. Else if the error to string call here contains, let's say, invalid email, which is another identifier Firebase gives you, you could set the error message to this is not a valid email address. Yet another check we can do here is error to string contains and check for the weak password identifier, which would be thrown if you somehow sneak in a password that's shorter than 6 characters. Then you could return a message where you say, this password is too weak. Of course, by the way, you don't have to implement such a detailed error handling. I just want to demo this. If you want something like this for your app or not, is of course for you to decide. So besides the weak password, we can also check for email not found. Another identifier Firebase might return for logging in that case. Here we could have an error message of could not find a user with that email. And my last else if case here is that I compare or that I check my error message here with contains for invalid password. So in case we entered a wrong password, then we can return invalid password as a message here. Now, if we make it into neither of these blocks here, because we have some other error, some other identifier, then this default message here will be taken. Now down there, we only have one message, and therefore we can actually also turn this into a const. It's a compile time constant. It will never change. And now the question is, how do we output that message? For that, we can simply show a dialog. Now, of course, I only want to show the dialog if we have an error. So here we could add a new method in this class, which returns nothing, let's say, which I name underscore show error dialog, where I expect to get my message that should be shown as an argument. And then in here we can call show dialog. You need to provide a context here, and as you learned, context is available everywhere in the state class. And you need to provide a builder, and in that builder you get a newly generated context, and there you can return your alert dialog. And in that alert dialog you can have a title of, which is a text widget actually, or should be a text widget of an error occurred, something like this. And then of course also have some content in there, and the content now simply is a text widget that wraps our message. And obviously you can now also add some actions here, some flat buttons if you want to, where you say OK, or you offer more options if you want to. I'll just add an OK button here, and if that is pressed, I'll simply call navigator of CTX pop to close that dialog. So now we can call this show error dialog method and forward our message to show such a dialog to the user. So here in both on HTTP exception catch as well as just catch, at the end I'll call show error dialog and forward the error message. With that, we should hopefully show a dialog if we have an error. Now, one other thing I of course also want to do, I want to make sure that the loading spinner goes away, and that should already happen because we're setting the state to is loading false after the entire try catch block. So even if we have an error, after all of that, this code will execute and the loading spinner should therefore be removed. Let's maybe do a hot refresh to reload our app entirely here. And then let's try signing up a user with an email address that already exists. So let's go to sign up here, confirm the password, click sign up. And we see this email address is already in use. Now let's try another email address. So this should now succeed actually if we sign up. Yeah, looks better. Let's try logging in now with a user that exists. We just created it, but with a wrong password. Actually, I should enter a longer password so that my local validation succeeds, but now invalid password, that's looking good. Let's try maybe a correct password, but an email which doesn't exist, and log in. Could not find a user. So that seems to work. And with that, we got error handling in place. We can now continue and make sure that if we do succeed with sign up or login, we actually move on to the shop instead of showing this login screen.